Hello, this is Geoghegan Green with Occupy Boston Live, bringing you the news and views the 1% doesn't want you to hear. Today we are going to discuss the fare hikes and service cuts proposed by the MBTA, which has caused an outcry across the state of Massachusetts. On January 3rd, 2012, the MBTA unveiled two potential plans to fix their $161 million budget deficit for the coming fiscal year. Both of these plans involve a combination of rate hikes and service cuts. Scenario 1 calls for a 35 to 40% fare increase for all T riders, a 75 to 175% increase for senior citizens and student passes, and the elimination of 10% of all bus routes. Scenario 2 is less steep in comparison on fare increases, with a general rate hike of 20% and an 85% increase for seniors. However, Scenario 2 calls for the elimination of approximately 58% of all bus routes. The MBTA has until April 4th to decide on which of these two plans to implement. Naturally, the MBTA's plans have caused many people to be concerned about the potential adverse effects on students, seniors, the disabled, and workers. To discuss the history behind the MBTA's plans and forthcoming actions, I am joined by Joe Ramsey of Occupy the T and Occupy Somerville, Kat Mead from Occupy Somerville, and Billy Geoghegan, a T rider. Thank you all for coming to Occupy Boston Live to discuss this important issue.
Thanks for having us.
So I think the logical place to begin is, how did the T end up in this position?
Well, in 2000, the legislature passed some laws that required the MBTA to have a balanced budget for the first time. So part of the reason is they have to balance their budget. They're legally required. But as part of the deal in 2000, they said they would give the MBTA 20% of all sales taxes, but in return, the MBTA had to take on a bunch of other transportation debt, over half of which came from the Big Dig. So right now, they're paying down their own increases in costs as well as the Big Dig and other transportation debt.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, that act in 2000, known as forward funding, was actually technically called the Enabling Act. In the sense, that act in 2000, that legislative act, has really enabled a lot of the trouble and the profiteering that's come forward. I would add to what Kat mentioned, that prior to 2000, the state of Massachusetts was obligated to cover whatever the budget of the T was for that year, right? So in 2000 they ceased doing that. They basically put a cap on how much state funds would be devoted to the T, not being about 20% of sales tax, right? And especially with the recession hitting, of course, sales tax, which is already a very regressive way to raise funds in the first place, you're seeing is it hits consumers and workers more. It doesn't take more from the rich than it does from the poor, for instance, as a progressive tax would. But with the recession, that the income from the sales tax declined as well, leaving the T doubly pressured and forcing the T to basically go into private capital markets to issue bonds in order to continue its operations. And that has essentially led to the ballooning of that already kind of excessive debt that goes back to the Big Dig. And it just got worse from there.
So I guess you've kind of already mentioned this, but I'd like to maybe clarify it slightly, is how does this issue relate to the Occupy movement specifically?
Many ways. You want to take a shot at it first?
Sure. Well, the cuts are definitely impacting the people who use the service most, all of whom are workers, students, the disabled, the elderly. They're clearly the 99% who are doing the work that enables the 1% to make all their money. And the cuts are hitting us worse. They're not hitting the people who have the majority of the wealth in the state.
I'd like to say that basically it's a political decision to, whether or not to keep public transportation public. If you want to privatize it, then it's a whole different thing, and we haven't really seen that mass transit has been effectively has been effectively forwarded by private corporations.
Yeah,
the origins of the T, going back to 1900, were to rationalize this system of private transits that were running all over the city and causing wreaking havoc and too much traffic and et cetera. Some were electrified, some were horse-driven, and they said, well, this is a public good.
Yeah.
We have to do it.
And I think that's very much in the Occupy spirit, right, is to defend attacks on public goods and public services, be they education or transportation, things that people need, right, that we believe people ought to have a right to, that shouldn't be limited based on people's income or their ability to pay for these services. I would personally put, healthcare as well as transportation, education, and a number of other things in that list of things that should be it should not be limited to based on income or wealth, and yet many of which are in this society already, such as healthcare, and it would be a real shame and a crime to allow that to happen to transportation as well. I mean, one of the relatively few kind of general goals that Occupy Boston agreed upon before being kicked out of Dewey Square was that we stood for the creation of a society where the needs of all are put before the profits of a few. And I think transportation is a need. It's a need to get to work. It's a need to get to school. It's a need not only for those reasons too, but a need to get around. Free people. I think to be a free people means you have the freedom of movement. As a friend of ours mentioned recently at a hearing at Somerville, where the MBTA was hosting kind of feedback opportunity on this, he made a really great point, which is that authoritarian regimes, dictatorial regimes, one of their kind of claims to fame, is to limit the mobility of people. To limit the mobility of people legally, or in this case, I think you could say financially. To limit the free movement of people is a great way, right, to kind of exercise control over society and keep those who perhaps have the most need and interest in changing that society from being able to do the organizing and the moving about that would take. So, that's kind of maybe a secondary point on this, but I think it's very much in the Occupy spirit, right, to try to stand to defend the people's needs against an attack which is in the interest of the few that are trying to extract profit from the situation, whether profit from bonds, owning bonds and collecting interest on the T's debt, or profit from privatizing the whole enterprise and turning it into a for-profit service altogether.
So just to play off what you just said, Joe, about the privatization, which Kat also alluded to, is what role do the banks play in all this?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to take a step.
I can try. I know it's extremely complicated. It's not as simple as the T simply owes a couple $1 billion to one of the banks. It's, they, like you said, there are bonds, there's interest on the bonds. The bonds are actually probably owned by, people who are invested in pensions. But right now, 30% of all the money the T is paying for its debt is actually going for interest payments on the debt. And you would think that maybe the banks could renegotiate a lower interest rate so that the T would be paying significantly less on its interest, and it could actually try to pay down its capital.
Yeah, the banks do hold, at least according to the estimates we have, this may not be publicly available information, but they do hold tens of millions of dollars of these bonds, right? And so they are directly profiting off of the interest that's accruing on those bonds. In addition, many of these banks, including J.P. Morgan, Chase, and others that have been given billions in bailout dollars, trillions in bailout dollars collectively, have also profited from the transaction. That is to say, from the buying and selling, and the chopping up and derivatizing and so forth of these T bonds. So they're making money coming and going here, literally. It amounts to this point about the same amount of money that we pay collectively in fares to the T goes, basically, people should imagine that going right out the back door to a bondholder, whether that be a bank or a pension fund or whatever. So it's not going to services, it's not going to workers, to give them health coverage. It's going to pay someone a profit on a loan that we think never should have had to be made in the first place if the T was fully funded, right? As the public good that it is.
I think all the discussion of banks and deficits is, it's somewhat bogus in a way. It's like, one thing is I don't very much understand it, but I think the administration of the T is just as much for public transportation as are the riders. They're just in a hard place, and and that's the legislature that's put them in a hard place. So, they would just, and I think they've actually, they didn't used to have feedback things for any of those transport, service changes or anything like that. They would just go do it. But now they have public meetings, and they've learned enough to set up the public meetings so that somebody's going to push them so that they can push the legislature to make things happen the way that they would like to see them happen. The example that I see is that the first meeting that they had about the service cuts was on the route in Newton where the Carroll School for the Blind was, which meant that you had, they had like, this was the first time that there was going to be a public meeting. It was the first time it was going to be in the paper, and so they had all the blind people in the wheelchairs and everybody out there, and that's because they don't want to cut service.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think it really is important to drive home that the MBTA isn't the primary enemy here, right? And I would say it even goes, we need to look even deeper than the legislature, although the legislature does have the power to allocate, to find new sources of revenue, whether that would be through taxes or shifting the money that's already there. But I would really want to push it even deeper. And again, this is in the Occupy spirit of the 99% and the 1%. I mean, we have been living through a period, an extended period. I mean, you could say it's hundreds of years, but I would say you can certainly take it since the 70s, where though productivity has been going up, workers have been producing more, working harder, longer hours with more technology, more efficiently, producing more stuff, and as they're asked to by their employers. That hasn't translated into more wages. That hasn't translated into more benefits for most people. You have stagnant salaries, and you've had an immense, accruing of profit at the top of society, whether in the hands of individuals or corporations. Banks being, where a lot of that profit flows to try to even increase itself, through speculation on top of the actual profit that's happening in the places of employment of workers. So you have this basically, the states are often, that immense wealth and power at the top has led to all kinds of sick symptoms, right? Including, that political power, which actually gives the rich who already have more money than they can spend in 10 lifetimes, tax cuts, right? Or gives them ways of avoiding the taxes that are even supposed to be levied, right? By, creating, lobbying and loopholes and so forth. So I think, we need to, I think, take this beyond simply the MBTA's budget and even the state budget and say basically, and really just reject this whole narrative of scarcity, which says, there's not enough money to go around, therefore we all need to tighten our belts. There's plenty of money. And the 1% has the money. And now they control around 40% or own about 40% of the wealth on Earth. Whereas the bottom 80% of the society virtually, is fighting for the crumbs, as I think 20% of the total human wealth. So I think we really, as Occupy, what I think we can bring that maybe some other groups aren't doing as actively because they're focusing on like the technical solutions they can find within the system, is to just try to debunk that framing, which says there's scarcity, therefore we all need to tighten up. You say, no, there's money, let's get it from the 1%. And if the politicians won't do it under pressure, then that says a lot about who they represent and don't. And so, that's, I think, what Occupy can bring to this is pointing out there is money, and it's just a matter of social priorities and really about political will to get it. We have trillions for war, we have trillions for bank bailouts, but somehow public transportation is something we can't afford. Give me a break. Give me a break. We need to reject that entire narrative and really talk about what the true crisis is here, which is that you have a few powerful people controlling the wealth and the labor of other people, and using that surplus that we all create to then oppress us and to make us have to pay our own way to work so we can be, exploited a little harder and faster by them. What kind of sick, sick discussion. And to the MBTA isn't the enemy, but only to the extent that they help to keep that narrative alive. I think they are part of the problem more than the solution. Even though I do agree with what Billy said that it's not a coincidence that they're like.
Well, do we sing the International now or later?
Yeah, right.
But I mean, I think what you said is the words that you said, political will, is to me it seemed to be the most important thing that this is all about. Is do we have the political will, to be able to have public transportation that's affordable for everyone?
Right. I know.
That's all. It's simple.
I know the Governor Patrick had suggested raising the gas tax a while ago and was burned so badly by that he'll probably never do that again, and which is been an ongoing problem for the last few decades. Taxes haven't gone up to that could go to funding infrastructure. Instead, all the focus has been on how private companies can make all this profit. And no, we can't fund infrastructure. So, it's not just the T is in bad shape. It's our roads, it's our bridges, it's everything, because there hasn't been a long-term transportation plan in Massachusetts. So everything's kind of a shambles right now.
And the $15 billion they spent on the Big Dig, right, didn't go, and that now is translated into massive debt for the T, right, didn't go into creating, public infrastructure in a way that would be, ecologically or sustainable or that would help to make, public transportation more accessible or affordable. So I think we should really think, again, historically as we look forward, like what would our system look like if we had spent that $15 billion on creating a state-of-the-art, world-class, public, accessible, free, clean public transportation system. We'd still have a lot of these political problems about the distribution of wealth, but we could be in a very better place, very much better place in terms of transportation, and that should be our kind of vision.
You
going
get
forward.
that, but we're in a bad place now. That's
right.
That's right.
We can see that.
In terms of, and I agree with what you're saying, is that we're told there's no money, but there's money for bank bailouts, for wars, and T-riders are expected to essentially take the hit. They're expected to pay. Like, how much more would an average T-rider have to pay?
Well, under one of the proposed scenarios, the monthly Link Pass, which gets you unlimited rides for a month on local bus and on the subway, would go from $59 to $80, which seems pretty steep, but apparently the cost for people who use the ride and for students and seniors who have special passes, their cost would go up over 100%, I think. So they'd be paying
over 100%.
Yeah, they'd be paying more than double what they're paying now.
For viewers who don't know, what is the ride?
The ride is a service that helps people with disabilities go basically door to door. So, if they really can't make it to a bus or a subway, they can't use those, they can use the ride instead, which I believe was put in place because many of the other services aren't handicapped accessible at all.
So essentially it's true. Banks got bailed out and T-riders did get sold out.
Yes.
You could say that.
Yeah.
You could say that. Surprise, surprise, huh?
Now, there's a Green Line E, I believe, is supposed to be eliminated. What are the ramifications of that? Why is that significant?
Well, it's only, the proposal is to eliminate its service on weekends only. So it's not completely horrible, but the problem is that on the weekends, this train runs down a major surface street in Boston, which serves the Museum of Fine Arts, Northeastern University, the Longwood Medical Area, which is huge and serves the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Medical School, as well as at the very end of it, the Veterans Hospital. So if all that service is cut on the weekends and you have to take the bus instead, what is the impact on tourism, on students, on everybody who has to access the hospitals on the weekends? The Museum of Fine Arts, what's the impact on tourism alone?
So essentially people don't have access to, say, health, education, and arts.
Well, when
Yeah.
they first did that, when they first redid the E line, it used to go all the way to Arbor Way and went through Jamaica Plain. And then when they cut that out, and there were public meetings all about this, and I don't know what the solutions are, but now the 39 bus follows that same route, and it's a double bus. And I have no idea, since I don't live in Jamaica Plain, or I've only been on the 39 bus a couple of times, but I have no idea whether that solution worked or not.
I've heard mixed things. I
Yeah,
know some
me
people who
too.
say the bus is a terrible alternative to the train. There have been times when I've worked on that Green Line, and there were times I would get out and I'd hop on the bus and it would actually pass the train and get where I was going faster than the train, because boarding, getting on and off the train takes a lot longer than the bus. But it probably really depends a lot on what traffic conditions are like, since they're both on the surface there. And of course, the other impact we can't forget is all the businesses that are served by the Green Line that have recently found out, some of them for the first time, that this service may be cut on the weekend, and that's going to impact their businesses as well.
We should also mention that it's not just the Green Line here, it's also the commuter rail. They're also proposing to cut on weekends as well as after 10 o'clock, which is, I mean, just imagine cutting the suburbs and you know, rural areas off from the city in that way. It's just something like this must not stand. And also the Mattapan bus line at the at the bottom, you know, at the south end of the red line on the Ashmont, you know, that connects Ashmont to Mattapan, is also, you know, proposed to be cut on weekends, affecting, you know, disproportionately, you know, people of color, and it's in that neck of the woods who depend on public transportation. You know, people are going to be stuck in their homes. People are going to be walking further in the cold and in adverse weather conditions. People are going to be put in unsafe environments as a result of this. These cuts, it's really, I mean, it's going to have a very harsh impact on many people. And it just cannot be allowed to stand these things.
It'll make the existing bus routes more crowded, or there will be more cars on the road as well.
Leading to more pollution, leading to more wasted hours in traffic. I mean, I'd like to go big picture again here. How many millions of hours do Bostonians or people in the Massachusetts area spend wasted in traffic every year? How many billions of collective human hours do Americans spend in traffic every year? I mean, I can't think of any. I mean, there are children starving. There are a lot of acute ways you could say this is a sick system. But for me, the idea of people sitting in traffic, cursing each other, wasting time they could be spending with loved ones or with artistic.
Or they could be spending it on the T reading.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I do.
Right. While burning up carbon, right? While creating air pollution and fueling global warming and giving kids asthma. Like, what's a more sick little, you know, snapshot you can take of an upside down and insane society than that? And this is, and in that context, we're gonna increase rather than decrease the traffic. We're going to, with 10% of global CO2 emissions coming from people driving cars, we're going to push more people into driving cars. It's lunatic. I mean, these people who would make a decision like this are illegitimate. I mean, at least from the standpoint of like what humanity needs right now. This is not, you know, this is not the conversation we should even be having. We should be having, how can we make it as close to free as possible, public transportation? How can we make it an option for everyone, so then we could have something like a gas tax without hitting workers unfairly in the pocketbook, right? Or we could really disincentivize or people from driving. You know, that's where we should be going. But of course, corporations don't want us to go that way, and the politicians in their pocket don't want us to go that way. Oil companies don't want us to go that way. But the 99% isn't hindered by those lobbying and all that money and and that's why we, I think, need to play the leadership role here, because the system as it's set up is not going to take on these big questions. That they would have us debate, you know, how much more can we cut when we should be talking about how can we expand.
Well, and I think probably part of that, you know, when they're looking at their cuts, I'm sure they're looking at ridership numbers and how much money they can save by cutting these buses. But I think their accounting is only taking limited factors into effect. They're not looking at what is the cost of keeping people with disabilities in their homes instead of being able to go and visit family or go to jobs, or the elderly. What is the cost to the youth of not being able to get into Boston from outlying suburbs because their bus lines are being cut? So these calculations are basically dehumanizing everyone, because they're not putting any kind of cost to the state on what cutting these services means, in other than the most sort of trivial way.
The human costs don't figure, right?
Right.
But, you know, people, you know, someone dying younger because they don't get adequate medical care doesn't figure in the, you know, it's not profit. Therefore, it doesn't count in a way. It doesn't, you know, it's, I mean, if, you know, when you drive in your car and they haven't fixed the roads, you hit a pothole and you blow a tire, that's good for the economy, I guess, right? It stimulates, you have to then go buy a tire, right? You know, you have to go buy a tire and stimulate, but is that actually good for, you know, for the general social welfare? I would argue no. Better to not have blown that tire and be able to spend that time or money on something else. But this is just the upside down framework where a lot of these conversations are stuck in.
Now, I just was wondering if you could tell people where they can find out more to get involved with all this, because you've laid out a bunch of great facts for us, a lot of interesting perspectives, but those who are watching and want to know more, where can they go?
There's a sort of coalition of citizen groups called Save the T, which has a website called savethet.org that you can go to. There's also an occupymbta.org site. Occupy Somerville will have information on our site as well.
You can go to Facebook, Occupy the. Can I look into the camera and say this? Occupy the T on Facebook. Also Occupy the MBTA on Facebook. You can also come to weekly meetings where the coalition group, or the Occupy the MBTA working group of Occupy Boston, is having weekly meetings, open organizer meetings if people want to get involved at SEIU 615 at 26 West Street, just outside of Park Street Station, right off Tremont. Again, that's 615 SEIU 615 local office, and people could come and join in the actual organizing if they want, but they can also find out more about the web on Facebook, Occupy the T, Occupy the MBTA.
Well, this is Doug Green for Occupy Boston Live, thanking Kat Mead, Joe Ramsey, and Billy Geoghegan for joining us today. This is Doug Ian Green, and I'm back on Occupy Boston Live to discuss the T hikes and service cuts with Kat Mead, Joe Ramsey, and Billy Geoghegan. Thank you all for continuing. And I'd like to ask what you've been up to in terms of outreach, current actions, future actions, and education.
Well, Occupy Somerville has been really active with handing out flyers at Davis Square and at Sullivan Square. Some people, I believe, have been riding the rails, getting on buses and informing people there at the time. This winter has actually been really good for flyering because with Red Line service not actually running in Davis Square on the weekends, people are standing around waiting for buses. We've also put up posters at a lot of bus stops as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a couple of things. I mean, we're educating people about what's going on. Some people aren't even aware of these cuts at all, although there is more and more media attention, so it's perhaps getting harder not to know about them. But we're letting people know what's going on. We're letting people know why we think it's wrong. We're letting people know, what alternatives are, or basically that this whole framework that's being put forth is nonsense and that we ought to reject it. And we're also, trying to inspire people to bring together that anger that exists, to direct it in the form of political protest. Both directed at the MBTA's own hearings to encourage people to show up and to really expose the problems with these plans that are being put forward, but also to participate in mass actions throughout the spring. I mean, this issue isn't going away, but we have a few weeks before, even months before this plan is implemented, and we are building resistance to it. So we're organizing mass actions on March 14th at the transportation building, mass transportation building, and then a truly mass action on April 4th at the State House. We're building in a Wisconsin-style People's Assembly, in which we are encouraging people from all across Boston to come and really not only demonstrate against what's happening, but to show our power in order to really hold these politicians accountable and make sure that they do not, or hold them accountable if they do not obey the will of the people. People have shown up at these hearings on their own, even without Occupy, encouraging them to. People have shown up and called out these officials and these plans, and we want to help people to turn that anger into power that can't be ignored by the state. April 4th at the State House, people should come down after work. It'd be great.
Now, Joe, you mentioned April 4th. Isn't there actually a historical significance of that particular date?
Yeah, well, there's two different, significance. One is that's the day that the MBTA is scheduled to announce its decision as to what its final plan will be. We should keep in mind, as of now, they floated two scenarios, right? They're not bound to either. We don't know what they'll come back with on that date or before that date. But on that date, in terms of this struggle, April 4th is significant for that reason. That basically the MBTA will be handing the State House, the legislature, its decision or its recommendations. So we want to be there to hold these really to expose and shine a light on what's going on. But April 4th is a very symbolic and powerful day, in modern American history. It's April 4th is the day that Martin Luther King was killed. It's also, we should mention, as he was working, to get involved in poor people's campaigns and workers' struggles in Tennessee, where he was assassinated. But in addition to that, it's also the anniversary of arguably one of the most powerful radical speeches he ever made, the A Time to Break Silence speech, or the Beyond Vietnam speech he gave on April 4th, 1967, eerily 1 year to the date before he would be assassinated. And essentially in that speech, King made a very eloquent, insightful, and controversial argument, which not only turning against the Vietnam War, but arguing that war was a symptom of a deeper malady, and that malady was essentially a society that put profits before the needs of people. As he said, I think famously, although it bears repeating and spreading wider, that a society that year after year spends more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift and people's needs is approaching spiritual death in 1967. I think as we look at this tea struggle where, again, trillions for war and billions for prisons, but public transportation is being told there isn't enough money to keep it going in a sufficient way. That dichotomy, that glaring outrage, that spiritual death, if you will, is still with us. I mean, if in 1967 America was in a state of approaching spiritual death, I guess we're in zombie capitalism by now. And so it's a powerful day, I think, for people across the city, as Occupy is looking for a kind of a spring flowering, if you will. I hope that April 4th not only can be a powerful date to focus on the tea, but to bring forward the community focused on the tea, but also raising these broader issues. And again, that basic Occupy principle, which is very much in like almost a quote from Martin Luther King's speech, which is to say, put the needs of all before the profits of a few. Put the needs of all before the profits of a few. I think Dr. King would approve on April 4th.
Now, you've mentioned about these public hearings. Have any of you attended? What's the atmosphere been like? In fact, are these hearings actually the proper venue?
Yeah, I went to the Somerville hearing, which was just this past week, and certainly the first hour or so was very energetic. People were angry, but they also seemed really excited to be there. They were, I think, glad to have their voices heard, and I think we have seen that even if we're not directly addressing the legislature, that seeing that thousands of people have come to hearings and sent in commentary has been effective at getting the MBTA to maybe reconsider what it's doing a little more. The legislature have gotten lots of calls and emails so that they know this is a serious concern. And the MBTA may have its hands tied slightly, but I think we're definitely showing that we care about our public transit.
And I mean, it was very moving and touching just to see, people coming out, people with extreme physical disabilities coming out. People who can't go up steps, even at non-accessible sites, and see them struggling to go forward, to tell the MBTA and their fellow community members how much they love their drivers, how much they value the workers that service the ride, for instance, and how scared they are about what this is going to mean if their service gets cut. But also to see the solidarity between, for instance, youth and elders and disabled folks, and like people having each other's back. Despite the insult that this and the fact it's like an insult to our intelligence, we're having to have this discussion at all, that they're proposing this, to see the population of Boston come together has been very moving. And again, it gives me hope that if and when the 99% actually can control this society, we in transportation, we can run things so much better. We actually care. People do care about one another. It's been very moving to see that, even if it's it's an unfortunate reason that we've had to come together to fight this particular struggle right now. But
well, I think public transportation is important, and it's important especially for. I'm an older person and I am disabled, although I'm not disabled enough to be able to get a reduced pass. But it's important for people to be able to get out. You don't want to just be sitting home all day watching TV and sleeping,
Yeah. Now, as opposed to the MBTA's public hearings, there have also been rallies. And what's been the attendance like? Who's been showing up? What are some of the slogans, the chants, and signs we've been seeing at these rallies?
Yeah, I've been to a few of them. I do think that the mass attendance has been at the hearings themselves. I think that the primary form at this of the expression of public outrage and even political responses to it has been directed at the hearings. I think you raise a good question. Is this the proper, is this the best way to direct that energy? Like, in other words, is the MBTA or the politicians or the banks that actually hold the power in the society actually listening, or is this just a chance for people to blow off steam? I mean, I think it's a very valid question. At Occupy Somerville, I don't think we can, we had close to 100 people attend a rally right after work. I think 80 to 90 people came to a rally, and chanting things like banks got bailed out, we got sold out, get the money from the 1%, tax the rich, fare hikes to pay the banks, no thanks was one of my favorite signs from Occupy Somerville. But really, besides just, what we've been doing in Occupy Somerville, and which I think is spreading around the city, we've gone to these hearings not just to have a demonstration, but to try to reach people who are spontaneously coming forward, right? And to help to organize them. So we gathered 60, 70 new emails and contact information from people at that Somerville hearing, and really I guess the test for us will be, can we turn these people out? Will people come forward on April 4th, on March 14th, and other actions leading up to those major actions? I think really that story is the real true rallies and mass actions are left to occur. That's our challenge right now, and the challenge for anyone who's watching this segment, frankly.
Yeah, and all the other organizations that have been doing work around the T issue have been getting people out for the rallies and for the hearings as well. The T Riders Union, ACE, Mass Uniting, seniors organizations, youth groups. It's been a really great sort of coalition collaborative experience.
Yeah, there were several hundred at the rally before the Copley hearing, I should say, at Boston. Again, these rallies right after work, out in the cold and so forth. So, I think those hundreds really represent thousands and thousands of people who would like to be there but can't, perhaps because they don't have adequate public transportation as it is.
Now, how else are you reaching people? And who else are you trying to reach? For instance, aren't there proposed cuts to actually T workers' jobs for that matter? And if one of you could elaborate on the 1940s song "Charlie on the MTA," and maybe a little of its history. I've heard it sung at several rallies.
There's a lot there. One thing, we're riding the rails, right? We're going out to the communities. We're talking to, the T isn't just an issue, it's a place, right? And in a sense, it's a great way to almost envision, at least in an urban context, who the 99% is or who we are. So one thing that I've been involved in personally, that many people at Occupy Somerville, at Occupy the T have been doing, is literally riding the rails, taking our Boston Occupier newspaper, which has and will continue to have some T coverage on there, T stories, but giving more background information, riding the rails, talking to people, making short speeches, letting people know what's going on, and that not only these cuts are happening, but people are fighting it. And my experience has been that people are very receptive, particularly when you get into, as I say, the further you go south on the red line. I've found more and more people. People giving rounds of applause when they hear that there's a fight back movement building. So the T riders across the city, the different lines, are a key audience here. Obviously, this is our struggle, and people are very receptive to it. There's also, of course, workers, as you mentioned, who think 500 jobs are slated to be cut with either of these two plans. So we have reached out to workers, and we need to continue to do that. Organized labor has started to come on board with the struggle a little bit, I think, and we're going to see more groups like Mass Uniting, SEIU, and so forth, groups coming forward to play some sort of supportive role in the struggle if they aren't already. I don't know what else we should add to that.
Well, the song "Charlie on the MTA."
I'd like to hear more about Charlie on the MTA.
Well, the origins of that, I believe, go back to the 1950s when there was even before that?
Much further.
The 40s.
I believe it's the 40s.
And that came out of, again, fare changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a fare hike, and it came out of actually one of the song came from one of the mayoral candidates who was fighting the fare hikes, and I forget what his name was, but that's where the song came from. Mm-hmm. And then there was the Kingston Trio.
Yeah, yeah. I have a little bit more on that. The progressive, the left-wing progressive, right, communist sympathizing, right, progressive party candidate. I can't remember his name either, but he didn't have money to compete with the Democrats and Republicans. He couldn't run radio ads. So he had some folk singers had developed this song, and they sang it off the back of trucks driving around the city, And the song tells the story of a man named Charlie, right, who is unable to leave the T because while he's riding it, there's a fare increase, a transfer fee that's implemented. So although he was able to get onto the T, he's not able to get off. So he's trapped underground, right, trapped on the train forever going across the city, much to the horror of his wife who gives him a sandwich every day, but somehow can't get him off the T. So, right. But so this song has over the years, as my understanding is, when there's been rate hikes or the song has kind of made a comeback, and that's happening again. There's a number of different versions that occupiers and others have updated to make it to make the song about like how Bechtel basically saddled the state with big dig debt, and that big dig debt was transferred to the T, and now the T is being driven into the hands of the banks by the debt, and so the lyrics have been updated in order to kind of bring the story up to the present. But in a sense, I mean, the insult of that, right? Think about Charlie, right? This guy who's trapped on the T because he doesn't have the money, and Mitt Romney, right, decides when they went to forward funding in 2000 with created the modern MBTA with the Charlie cards, puts the name of Charlie on our card, right? So in a sense, we're all kind of prisoners, I guess you could say, or to these kinds of fare increases.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
But the song actually, where this said that you had to go out and vote to get Charlie off the MTA.
They wanted people to vote, right?
And in that way, I think I don't disagree with Occupy's way of dealing with things, but I do think that putting pressure on the legislature via these hearings is an important way for a democratic society to express, that this is a social good. It's like water,
Arguably, I mean, you could say there should be these sorts of hearings when other decisions, budgetary decisions, are coming down the pike, right? I mean, why haven't we to have a series of public hearings about the war budget or about whatever about whatever they're planning to cut next, right? Whether at the federal level or the or the state at the state level, the city level. I mean,
well, they do, but we're not invited.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Well, we should bust into those meetings, perhaps.
I think if they actually had a discussion on the actual war budget, that it would actually be cut, which is probably why it's never held.
There needs to be some pressure for
But
that.
there's something I wanted to, it was kind of alluded to in our previous segment, and that's the gas tax. As someone who not only rides the T, I also have a car, and I'm a little wary about, say, having a gas tax. I find it's like, how do you feel about the gas tax?
Oh, I kind of have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it hasn't been raised in a very long time, so if they're raising fares for public transit, why can't they raise the cost of car ownership? Because that degrades the roads, which affects the buses and all these other things. But on the other hand, it's also, it hurts people who can afford it the least, just like raising the fares on public transit. And clearly it's a very politically dangerous thing to do. I think I mentioned previously, our current governor was burned very badly when he tried to suggest raising the gas tax recently. So it's not a perfect solution by any shot.
As a person that brings a kind of Occupy perspective to this struggle, I'm very wary of it, and I see it as, although I do favor long-term actions to disincentivize or to reduce car drivership or whatever. I don't support a gas tax because I think it can be, and it has been used as a way in politicians to kind of split the 99% on this issue, right? To try to make it not an issue of the banks or the rich have the social wealth and we need to take it back and put needs ahead of profits, and so it's 99% versus 1%. They want to shift it to, they'd love to have it be car drivers against T-riders, right, if they can, or neighborhood versus neighborhood if they can, and so forth. So I think there's a real political danger for us in endorsing or being perceived to endorse a gas tax, although I do think that once we have free or close to free public transportation that's truly affordable, accessible, and green, then at that point, I would be in favor of doing things to reduce, to kind of, coax people in one way or another to not drive. But I think we're far from that point right now, and so I would be hesitant to endorse that, or even to be.
Well, I'm not far from that point. I've been riding the T only. I haven't driven for 25 years, and I've been riding the T. And I feel politically that gas usage is subsidized, or at least de facto subsidized, and sort of. I sort of think that it's part and parcel of people making political decisions about what they should have publicly.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning. I mean, one of the reasons, the fact it wasn't just an act of God or nature that ended up with the U.S. so much of the American public being dependent on car travel, right? I mean, that
That's right.
There are actual cases out in California where they had a wonderful light rail system was actually bought up by General Motors and destroyed. Is right? I mean, early in like the 1930s or whatnot. That is to say, there are commercial, capitalist interests who have actively worked to prevent a public system, a public transportation system from developing in the way it has in some European countries, right? There's a lot of money to be made by making people buy cars as well as gasoline. Of course, it's totally devastating to the planet to force think about the inefficiency of it, even from just how much time we spend driving rather than reading or talking to one another or whatnot. It's totally bad for our human existence as well as the planet, but it's great for some people to make a profit off of it. Again, we need to look at the history here. I'm not an expert in this history, but we need to frame these issues in a historical way. And how did we get to this point? And how have the interests of the 1% often deformed our possibilities? And going forward, where are they doing it now?
I think also, in terms of this history, in terms of this discussion, we've touched on a lot of issues that I don't think really get discussed by the 1% press. How has the 1% press actually discussed this issue, framed this issue? Has there been any depth or substance to it? Because not everyone is involved in Occupy, and not everyone receives the occupier, but how have people, say, been perceiving a lot of this through the 1% press?
Well, I don't know if the Somerville patch counts as the 1% patch. 1% press.
Probably not.
They've done some really good coverage on it. I have seen a few big front page articles on the Globe, like after the big hearing at Copley Square, that seemed to have it pretty well covered. But generally, I found better coverage in sources other than the Globe.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much public outrage about this, and the people are coming out in such numbers. I don't think that the mainstream press, at least the print press, can't ignore it. I mean, I haven't been able to follow the mainstream television coverage that closely, but so they have been covering it, and I think they are giving some expression to the emotions that people have. There is a little bit of a narrative developing, though, as Occupy and other political groups get more involved and try to politicize these issues and raise the issues about wealth. There's a little bit of a narrative I saw in their most recent Globe story about the Somerville hearing, right, or Boston.com. They're kind of trying to split off kind of the legitimate kind of concerns of community members who are, I guess it's okay to cry, or just to be upset, about these cuts. But if you start to actually connect the dots and politicize it and talk historically about where there is wealth, then you're a political rabble-rouser or something like that. You're not actually a legitimate member of the community. So that's one narrative that you see, I think, in some of the mainstream coverage, is to try to kind of separate as if occupiers aren't also part of the community, which we are, right? Or not something separate from it. And the other thing is that their framework is often very narrow. The mainstream press won't get into very often, or even quote people talking about the distribution of wealth issues, the political issues that we're trying to raise. They have a kind of narrow focus, right? To some extent, they tend to accept the kind of framing that the state is introducing.
Well, they tend to accept the framing of the entire society.
Right,
I mean, it's sort of like, it's like roll out the wheelchairs and, we have to help the helpless. But on the other hand, the able-bodied need this too, and sort of like everybody needs it.
That's right.
And if we all used it, it's ironic that all of these talks of cuts come after they have record T ridership.
Yeah.
And I wonder about that. I mean, I wouldn't want to say there's any conspiracy because I don't believe in conspiracies, but it's ironic that when the T finally looks like it's a modern, functioning organization, the buses are on time more often than not. Most of the trains are new. There's a lot more handicapped access than there used to be. Now we have to cut that out. We don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist either, but I think you could argue that any well-functioning public entity, be it Social Security, which is actually, without whatever its problems, did successfully address the problem it was set out to fix, which was that there was an incredible poverty amongst the elderly, right? And now that really Social Security helped. As long as there's a fully functioning, whether it's public transportation or Social Security, a public service, that's in some sense a threat of a good example to those who want us to believe that society can only be run efficiently or effectively or at all if things are run for profit and under the management of those who own and control capital. Right, so to some extent, although I'm not aware of any backdoor meetings. Well, actually, maybe I am. There is one person to talk about.
I don't know. It's
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, why isn't public housing like the public library? And it's not, obviously.
Right.
But the public library, there's no stigma to. But public housing, there's a stigma to. And why is that? I mean, and public transportation, it's sort of in the middle between that.
Well, I think part of it is that if it's public, then the government can control costs, and people aren't going to pay as much money as they would be forced to pay if it was run by a private for-profit corporation. And Joe had just alluded to this. In January, the Department of Transportation hired a new chief financial officer, Dana Levinson, who has a history. His entire work history is selling public infrastructure or leasing it to private interests. And he did this when he worked for the city of Chicago. They leased a toll road for 99 years. And when these private companies invest in public infrastructure, they expect to make their money back within 15 years. So no matter how much money they're giving a city government or a state government for what they're getting, they're expecting to make their money back in a short amount of time, far shorter than the lease term, which suggests that if the government kept control of it, they could probably make that money back much more than they're getting a single check at first. So while we haven't heard yet what the Department of Transportation or the government is going to propose for our transportation for the MBTA, I'm really kind of worried about what it means that they've hired as their chief financial officer and real estate asset development guy, someone whose entire field of expertise is figuring out how to broker deals to give away public infrastructure. Maybe it won't affect the MBTA, but we've got all these roads, and privatizing roads and turning them into toll roads is kind of has been a thing that's been going on in the last 10 years in this country. So who knows?
Mr. Privatization.
Yes,
And
Mr.
Mr. Privatization. Yeah, and I think it's not a coincidence if that is their long-term plan or one of their it's not surprising that they wouldn't put that forward, right? Because there'd be such a public outcry against it, I believe. Another thing, but this all calls up another important issue, which is that even Tom Menino, right, at the Copley hearing, and many other politicians have pointed out this is a Band-Aid, on a deeper problem, right? These cuts, as draconian as they are, and the fare increases, and is how severe as they are only a one-year quote-unquote solution for that $160 million. The interest rates on many of these bonds that are held by banks and other private investors, as well as pension funds, whatnot, that the T is going to have to pay back. Those interest rates are going up like next year. So I think it's over 200 million the shortfall that so you can see how the T could be driven into the hands of a private brokered deal, right? If ever they keep cutting service, they diminish the public support for it, and they create more and more of a sense that it's a crisis, and frankly, public transportation is such a mess. Well,
right.
Lo and behold, here's a solution. Let's turn it over to a good, efficient business operator, right? And who will cut worker benefits and outsource and get rid of the unions, and as well as jack up fees or have fewer buses so they only run them when they're totally packed, right? As they're thinking in terms of profit maximization instead of people's needs, servicing the people's needs. So again, I'm not aware of that plan, but they wouldn't make that plan public. Maybe we can get a whistleblower who will leak it to us. That would be great.
But that's how these things happen. They claim, the government can't run it well. We'll hand it to a business that has expertise in this area, and they can run it and they can make a profit and it'll be more efficient. But then they jack up the fares as high as they can.
Well, I think they do a damn good job of running it, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
As someone who depends on it all the time, they do a pretty good job. I have very few complaints. And most of the complaints that I hear about the T currently are usually from people who don't use it very much.
Or it's people who do use it and they want it to be better and they want more trains. There you go.
But the people who use it all the time don't complain that much.
And one thing I would want to say is that, at least at Occupy the MBTA and Occupy the T, we are putting forward, we want to make clear that we see the workers here that make the trains run on time, if you will, to be part of the 99% as well, right? So we're saying not only no cuts, no hikes, but also no layoffs. No hikes, no cuts, no layoffs, and perhaps also we say get the money from the 1%. Don't just shift it around from some other social program that people actually need, right? Pit education against transportation. If you get it from the war budget or get it from the 1%, and not by pinching workers, which I think is another thing we do see floated in the press and by politicians. The idea that they could squeeze more out of, but if they just negotiate the union contracts more, aggressively, right, from the management standpoint. So we have to stand with the workers and the job they do, which I think is generally very good. I have very few complaints myself.
We could go on literally for several hours on this, but we are almost out of time. And I do agree with what you've been saying, Joe. And in fact, it's quite clear in discussing and hearing you all explain the history and the actions behind these MBTA cuts that we actually do live in a society that privileges, to twist the Occupy motto around, the profits of a few before the needs of the many. But I think to end on a slightly lighter note, could any of you maybe share one story of outreach actions that you would with the audience?
I don't know if it was outreach so much, but at the Somerville hearing, I did explain to people about our new chief financial officer in the Department of Transportation, and the audience reaction was really, well, it was kind of bad in one way because they were clearly alarmed to hear who was perhaps coming to affect the MBTA, but it was good to know that people were now aware of this and they disapproved.
Every time I ride the T and make my little pitch, 90-second pitch for Occupy the T, tell people what's going on, say this is an unjust, unfair, unnecessary tax on workers and students to go to school or work, I'm really just thrilled by the response I see from people. I see people who, I'm not saying anything groundbreaking or new, but I feel like people are ready. Many people are very fed up. I'll see 60, 70% of people on a train, sometimes more than that, take the paper, take the leaflet, take a stack and pass them down the aisles. I've seen high school kids, in Dorchester, giving a round of applause because they're so excited, that they're aware of these issues. So I see the people, ready to really fight on this, and that inspires me.
Okay.
I'm not an activist, so.
Yet.
All right. This is Doug Green with Occupy Boston Live. Thank you for joining us today.